Your brother's name is Cedric?
Oh, no, that was his Cabbage Patch Kid. My brother's name's Dan.
I'll bet your new friend Dan would love to hear all about how classy you are.
Dan? Hi. I'm Blair Serena's friend.
Hey.
Well, besides, you're bringing Dan, right? But are you worried that he already has a date? I mean, he is Dan Humphrey. Shut up.
Who does this Dan Humphrey think he is? Serena is putting up a strong front, but I can see how hurt she is.
I heard on Gossip Girl that you were having sex with Dan out here. And streaming video.
What about Dan? It's so nice what you're doing for your friend Dan. Helping his girlfriend make his Christmas present. I think you like Dan a little too much. Michael Moore over there is obviously just using this film to get close to Dan. First, I'm sorry. About Dan, about the Gossip Girl blast, and about not telling you about Nate.
Okay.
Did you tell Dan?
What?
You did. You told your low-rent boyfriend, and he told his social climbing sister who wears my hand-me-downs, and she blabbed to Nate.
Hey, Dan's not hanging out in Brooklyn again this morning. He's with you at school, right?
No, not yet, but he'll be here soon. Why?
Just tell him I say hi.
Why don't you just tell Dan about her? Dan Humphrey actually lent a hand. It was nice to see him get his dirty for once. Speaking of true love, Dan isn't here.
Have you talked to Dan?
The only thing lamer than dating Dan Humphrey is mourning Dan Humphrey.
Dan likes soccer, right? Or football, as Marcus calls it. You think it'd be too weird if he came?
You're finally free from Downer Dan, and I have my old Serena back. And with your ex being Dan Humphrey, you win by default.
Us? This girl is Dan with boobs.
For instance, Serena and Dan used to.
Oh, I didn't know.
Of course he didn't. That's what friends are for.
But now that you know...
You understand.
Pretty sure. Yeah.
If you or Humphrey ever breathe a word of this, one word, to anyone, you'll regret it for the rest of your lives. You understand? It was simple, really. Chuck wanted to get Dan, and I wanted to get you.
Just like I'm sure Dan doesn't think about you and Aaron all horizontal and sweaty. Hey, what's up with Gossip Girl putting out a hit on Dan?
Excuse me?
Apparently, Gossip Girl is looking for evidence to prove that Dan's cheating on you. Not that anyone else would ever want Dan Humphrey. No offense.
Dan Humphrey? He's like a cafeteria lady who won the lottery. You couldn't pry that acceptance from his hands with the jaws of life. Dan must be pissed. His hope of arriving on campus with cachet has been shot to hell. Now he'll just be lumped in with the rest of the financial idiots and poets.
Looks like Humphrey has some competition. Let me guess, Dan Humphrey.
Of course, there is the odious task of playing opposite Dan Humphrey. Dorota. And if I didn't, that means Dan Humphrey did. Vanessa told him about Marcus, and he could have put that out too, all to get back at me for Teachergate. You want tea? No. I want Dan Humphrey's head on a platter.
Not good. Like Dan having sex with Rachel Carr in the costume closet during the school play. Not good.
Dan's a writer?
You're drifting away from Dan and your family, and you've lost Nate, one of your oldest friends. But they'll care if they hear their favorite Queen of the Dead had a menage with disgusting Dan Humphrey and his celebutante girlfriend. But Nate loves Serena. Dan loves Vanessa, God knows why, and Chuck loves me. Now all you have to do is tell Dan and Nate that you'll be in the city next year.
Except Humphrey's a donut. And don't worry, not even you choosing a Humphrey will ruin my date. Nothing will.
I love you, Nate, or I love you, Dan. Well, it's all right, now that I'm an egalitarian. I'll accept it even if you choose Dan, and not just because he's ahead in the Gossip Girl poll.
Did the plane ride back to reality land you on either Nate or Dan?
I love Nate, then Dan again, Aaron, Gabriel, Carter, Tripp, then Dan again, then Nate again.
Oh, and it's your business to be monitoring Nate and Juliet? And even worse, Humphrey and Dumpty? Yes, you're right. Maybe Dan and Nate will see the error of their ways and break up with those girls. Or they'll marry them and you'll die hitting refresh.
Now, Humphrey has proven his worth in the past. He could be useful to us now.
Serena, you promised to stay away from Nate and Dan. Wait, are you telling me you chose? And that things with Dan and Vanessa are...
I think. Maybe, yeah.
Well, as much as nature would applaud you for heading off any possible future Humphrey Abrams offspring, you have to ask yourself, are you ready to do what it takes to make him yours? Fine. Where's Dan?
How'd it go with Dan?
No Dan? And in that dress, I'm shocked.
If Serena hadn't kissed Dan, then Nate wouldn't have been at the hospital looking for her, and Jenny wouldn't have come looking for Nate.
So Anne, Nate, and Dan are all liars.
You know, I'd never even been to Brooklyn until Serena met Dan Humphrey. Now I know the drive way too well.
Speaking of fights, I'm at full-on war with Humphrey. But Dan is a writer. He makes delicious coffee. Never mind the fact that he's not a completely horrible-looking straight guy working at a fashion magazine. It's got the whole office buzzing.
And I thought I found my calling, and now the only thing that brings me any joy is planning Dan Humphrey's long, slow demise.
I am not friends with Dan Humphrey, and to prove it, I will happily skip the boys' exhibit and leave him hanging. I would rather shop anyhow. So come on, let's go. First stop, Chloe.